All right, well, thank you for inviting me to be here today, and thank you all, especially those of you from out of state, for coming to Texas. It's not always this wet, but we love it when it is. So I'm going to be talking about a different kind of fire than we've been talking about so far, as the pictures probably clued you in. We're not talking about our nice, like, low-intensity understory burns. Before I get started, I did want to acknowledge that a lot of this work was funded by a cooperative agreement between the Nature Conservancy and the Department of Defense, and the 2020 data that I'll be sharing today was collected by the University of Illinois. I also want to acknowledge that this area has been inhabited and stewarded by indigenous people since time immemorial, and their stewardship and use of the land continues today, including at the Leon River Medicine Wheel, which is still managed by fire and used for worship today, and this is on the study area that I'll be talking about. And as we talked about already today, thinking about indigenous fire management is really important, particularly when we're thinking about grasslands and savannas, because they were really a big part of having these high-frequency fire regimes that give us grassland and savannas. And then, as Norma talked about, where we have less frequent fire, we tend to get woodlands or forests. Mark also talked a little bit about fire recovery strategies. So how do plants respond to fire? So some of them will resprout from underground organs. So the individual may be top killed, but the underground system survives and it can send up resprouts. Other species are completely top killed and they have to rely on seed, either from the seed bank or seed dispersal, to come back into the area. And this is going to become important as we talk about the different species here. Norma also talked about the golden cheek warbler, which is a flagship endangered species for Central Texas. Us Texans really like the golden cheek warbler because it's the only bird that nests only in Texas. So every single golden cheek warbler is a Texan, so we feel very responsible for making sure that this species persists. And as she pointed out, they need oak-juniper woodlands. They need the junipers because they use the shredding bark to build their nests. It's very cool. They use spider webs to stick all the little pieces of bark together. Early in the breeding season, they eat insects, primarily caterpillars, off of oaks and other hardwoods, and then later in the breeding season, as the oaks build up their leaf defenses, they switch to eating caterpillars off of the junipers. So the study area that I'm going to be talking about today is the newly renamed Fort Cavazos. If you're from Texas, you may know this as Fort Hood. It's a over 200,000 acre military installation in Central Texas, and it's a nesting site for endangered birds. So we talked about the golden cheek warbler already. Bill earlier this morning talked a little bit about the black-capped vireo. The black-capped vireo is now delisted, but was listed as endangered for most of the time that we were working. Black-capped vireos, unlike the warblers, use shrublands. That's where Bill was talking about the doorknob height. They build their nests really low, which means like foxes can eat their eggs. It doesn't seem like a great survival strategy to me. But anyway. So Fort Cavazos is at this really interesting junction between ecoregions. Like Norma said, you know, ecoregions, we draw lines on a map that aren't necessarily exactly real, but they're sort of kind of real. So when you get close to these lines, interesting things happen. So the cross timbers is actually very similar to the oak savannas that Mark was just talking about. The Edwards Plateau often has some denser woodlands, and we see all of those things mixed together in this area. It's sometimes called the Lampasas Cut Plains, and it has this very characteristic topography where you have these big flat grassy plains with grasslands and some savannas, and then these flat-topped hills that often have woodlands on the slopes and sometimes also on the tops. So I'm going to give you just a few pictures to give you a sense for what the different vegetation types are like. These mesa tops, the soils are incredibly shallow. We have huge areas with bedrock outcrops. Even in the areas where we have woodlands or shrublands, the soil's very shallow. You can see a bunch of rocks sticking out underneath the duff there. And we also get different oak species that occur in these different habitat types. So the mesa tops, we tend to have shin oak or Quercus breviloba. On the slopes, they're a little bit more mesic, so we get Texas red oak, Quercus bucklei. In some of the more sheltered canyons, we get chinkapin oak. There's even a few so-called lost maples, big tooth maple in these areas. But mostly it's the Texas red oak in these areas, also a lot of juniper. And then we have this other habitat that I'm calling deep soil because it feels a little bit wrong to show you a picture like this and call it savanna, but this really should be a post oak savanna, post oak blackjack oak. For those of you familiar with the range sites in Texas, this is the Redland range site, so these are much deeper soils. They tend to be on some of the flatter areas. So I promised repeated fires, so we have repeated fires, and again, these were crown fires. Fort Cavazos is an active Army base. They have training ranges where they shoot things, including incendiary devices, and those things work. They do start fires, sometimes unintentionally. So February 1996, three fires were started. This was one of those Februaries that makes us despair for the summer to come. It was 90 degrees in February with howling winds, extremely active fire effects. The fire jumped a 4-lane highway. So this is like you know, the stuff that we think happens in California, but it happens here sometimes too. So this burned over 4,000 hectares of woodland. And then in April 2009, another fire similarly started by military training activities reburned part of that 1996 fire, which set up a really cool opportunity to look at how these woodlands respond to repeated crown fires. So this is a map of part of the area. The kind of light gray is the 96 fire, the black is the 2009 fire, and then you can see, I couldn't point in both directions, so sorry for y'all on that side. So these are the twice burned ones. We have some once burned ones just off the top of the map, and then these are the unburned areas that we're using as our controls. We don't have pre-data before 1996, but this area was pretty uniform, so we feel very comfortable in saying that the unburned areas probably looked like the burned areas did before they get burned. This is what it looked like after the second fire in one of those areas. So again, we're not talking low intensity, nice crown fire. This was taken about 2 months after the fire. It looks pretty devastating when you look at it this way, but if I take away that little box, you can see, as we all know, oaks are amazing resprouters. So even a couple months after the fire, we were already seeing a lot of regrowth. I will show you data, but I know there's a lot of folks in here who aren't from this area, so I wanted to give you some visuals so you kind of see what the data means, because I know that helps me when I'm thinking about ecosystems that I'm not familiar with. And I'll go through each of our different habitat types. So again, this is what an unburned mesa looks like. And these unburned areas are really hard to take good pictures of because they're really dense. This is a once burned area, so after the 96 fire, and the picture quality of the early pictures is a little iffy because they're from scanned slides that we had. But as the time goes on, you can see the vegetation regrowing. It's starting to catch up to where the original unburned vegetation was. And then 2009, it got reburned again. So this is just a couple weeks after the fire. This is about a month and a half after the fire. So lots of stuff growing back. And then it continues to grow back, and this is what it looks like today. Similar story on the slopes. The interesting thing on the slopes, because they're more mesic, some of these oak resprouts were like 6 to 8 feet tall within a year or two. So the storage underground that these trees have is really quite amazing. It keeps growing and growing and growing. We get another fire, things start resprouting really quickly, and then this is what it looked like in 2020. All right, so here's some of the data that I promised. So I have several graphs that are set up the same way, so I'll just kind of walk you through what this is going to look like. I'll have paired graphs of the mesas and the slopes, because things are sometimes a little bit different. We've got a different species composition there. Time since fire on the bottom, and then I'll always have an unburned site for reference, so you kind of know where we're maybe headed to. And in this case, I've got stem density on the y-axis. So it was really interesting because after the second fire, we had almost an order of magnitude higher stem density than we did after the first fire. I think that is because the plants at the time of the second fire were smaller, and a lot of species tend to resprout. There's like a little bit of youthful vigor that the smaller, younger plants can resprout better. But those resprouts thin themselves out really quickly, and so by 2020, which is 11 years after the second fire, really there's no difference in stem density between the once burned and twice burned sites, and they're sort of stem density wise like really headed to where those unburned areas are. And it's interesting because if you just look at the picture from '96 and the picture from 2009, it doesn't really look like there's that much higher stem density, but we spend a lot of time counting stems out there, so I'm pretty confident in those numbers. In the overstory stem density, initially on the mesas, so understory stem density, I forgot to mention, that's everything under 4 feet tall. Overstory densities, everything over 4 feet tall. So in the mesas, originally the overstory stem density was much lower after the second fire, and that makes sense because if the plants are putting a lot of energy into making many resprouts, those resprouts are probably not going to get as tall. But then they sort of caught up. On the slopes, interestingly, we didn't see that. Even though the initial understory stem density was super high, the overstory density was also pretty high and really tracked with where the initial fire was, and maybe even now is a little bit higher, or was in 2020. And here too, after the first fire, things are sort of headed to where the unburned areas were. That in the slopes, the second fire, we may actually have higher stem density. But if you think back to those pictures I showed you, like those 2020 pictures didn't look like the unburned pictures. So even though we have the same number of stems, if we look at tree basal area, we have a long way to go before we get back to where we started. So there's a lot of stems, but they're all still very, very small. In this case, trees we counted as everything over about 2 centimeters dBH, which was still a pretty small thing to count as a tree, but we don't get a lot of rain out here, so we have to be generous with our definitions. So what I focused on so far are the mesas and the slopes because I've got once and twice burned sites. So the next what I want to talk about are our deep soils, the post-oak soils. And for this one, we only have once burned sites, so I don't have any twice burned. And I'll do the same thing, just show you a series of pictures of what these looked like as things regrew. It got pretty dense in there. You can imagine dragging, these were 100-meter long transects we were measuring. Okay, so understory stem density. These deeper soils a little bit more mesic, so we see a bigger spike in stem density, but it's starting to decline towards, it's actually still, at least in 2020, was higher than in the unburned areas. Sapling stem density, similar pattern. You see that spike, and then as things start to get into the tree size, you actually get this little decrease in the saplings. Tree stem density, just like in the mesas and the slopes, our stem density is pretty similar to what it was in the unburned area, but our basal area is still lower, although not as much lower in these deeper soils as it is on the mesas and the slopes, partly because I think the tree basal area was just lower to start with, and also these deeper soils, things tend to grow a little bit faster. So I told you all about the woodland structure, but I haven't really addressed species composition. So this is a photo of one of our twice burned sites. And unless you're from the area, you probably don't know what species you're looking at. There's some oaks in there, there's a little bit of sumac. But if you look at this unburned woodland, what we have, the dark greens are the junipers, and the light greens are the oaks. And there is no dark green in this picture. So what happened to the juniper? Well, I mentioned way back in the beginning, we talked about plant regeneration strategies after fire. We've got the resprouting things, which are the oaks, all the hardwoods, almost everything out there except for ash juniper. Ash juniper is not a resprouting juniper, which gives us an advantage over all of you having to deal with eastern red cedar. But where did all the juniper go? And it's not just the pictures, like this is the data, this is the understory juniper density, like there really is no juniper in these areas. And this was really surprising to us because when we manage our grasslands, we have to burn them every 3 to 5 years, otherwise they turn into those cedar breaks that Norma described. And even on those deep soils, we're still not seeing a lot of juniper. So there's a couple things that I think are happening. One is that I think we burned up the seed bank. These were really, really hot fires. You can see in this photo, we burned away all the leaf litter, all the duff. In some cases, we burned down into the mineral soil. There were cracked limestone rocks all over the place. So anything in those top couple centimeters of soil probably is completely toast. Another factor is how big these fires were, because Norma talked about these juniper berries, as we call them. They get dispersed by all kinds of birds and many kinds of animals, but they only get dispersed so far. And these were enormous fires. Everything you see in this picture was burned in the second fire and had been burned in the first fire. So you have to go sometimes a mile or more to find a living juniper that's big enough to make seed. So the seed rain into these areas is really, really slow. Even if the junipers manage to get there, juniper seedlings are teeny tiny for a really long time, and they're competing with all of these resprouting species that get to be 6 feet tall in a year or two. So there's just no light available for these junipers. So I know this is the session on fire and flora, but I'm going to bring a little bit of fauna in here too. So why does this matter? Well, we have these two birds and a bunch of other things, but I'll focus just on these two birds that have very different habitat requirements. We talked about the golden-cheeked warblers need mature oak juniper woodlands. The black-hat vireos want shrublands, which has always been, for those of us managing for both of these birds, like it's an interesting spatial puzzle to put these habitats together. This is what black-hat vireo habitat looks like. This is some of the reburned areas. The black-hat vireos really liked these fires, particularly on the mesas where it's dry and the vegetation regrowth is slow. Some of these reburned areas were black-hat vireo habitat for almost a decade afterwards. The slopes not so much, just because they get tall so quickly. Vireos just don't like tall things. So the little vireo says, "Thanks for the fires, everybody. Really helped me out." And this is sort of what the warblers had to do. We had bird biologists out there in 1996 in early March when the warblers come back from their migration. And they had some birds fly. These birds tend to be fairly faithful to their territories. If they were successful, they'll come back to the same place. So we had birds fly into the middle of these burned areas and sit at the top of the little tree skeletons and sing a few times and then look around like, what am I doing here? Flew off somewhere else. And because we are missing that juniper component from these crown fire areas, it is going to be a really, really long time before these areas are golden-cheeked warbler habitat again. That doesn't mean that there isn't a ton of warbler habitat other places, but people like Norma said, people like building their houses in warbler habitat, and so trying to balance where we maintain black-hat vireo habitat and where we allow golden-cheeked warbler habitat to regenerate is, like I said, it's a very interesting puzzle. But we know that if we let crown fires happen in mature oak juniper woodlands, it's going to be a really long time before that's warbler habitat. And so if your management goal is warbler habitat, keeping really big fires out of that is probably the way to go. So conclusions, our broadleaf hardwoods, I mostly talked about the oaks, but this includes ashes, maples, sumacs, lots of other things. Though they're pretty resilient to multiple crown fires. There are areas inside the sort of the bullseye of Fort Cavazos where all the training ranges face into, and we get almost annual fires. It takes decades to burn enough to kill these oaks, which I know a lot of you all know in here. Ash juniper recolonize these large burned areas really slowly, and so where we want to manage for ash juniper, we really need to manage against the crown fires. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.